Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Aney.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
And this is Dr. Tim Furnish, who writes about the Middle East and Middle Earth. And this is the Break It Down Show. I'm glad to be on.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, Middle Earth. You do. You write about that. You've been on the show a number of times in several capacities. One as a judge for the album fights, which is, I know, fun, and we'll for sure discuss that at some point in this episode. At least I hope. And then we also have had you on as our Middle Eastern expert, our Islam expert, and it's always good to have Dr. Tim Furnish on the show.
And it's an honor to be on, Pete.
Talk to me about counterinsurgency in the Ottomans.
Ottoman counterinsurgency, right. And I keep saying it's almost done. It really is almost done, I promise. Otherwise, my wife's going to take something blunt to my head if I don't get it done soon. Basically, in the run-up to the 2016 election, and then after Trump was elected, I was looking at a lot of policy stuff, and a number of books that had come out. For example, like Seb Gorka's book, for example, about defeating jihad, and there are a number of others. That's probably the best lot. And I read that, and a number of other books. I also read a number of books by some Muslim clerics talking about defeating ISIS and things like that. And then what struck me was that we didn't have. I couldn't find any works anywhere that talked about how Islamic states had dealt with Islamic rebellions, Islamic jihads. Basically the approach is always, because we're Westerners, the approach is almost always, in fact, it is always, I can find no exceptions to this, which is why I'm writing one. The approach is always, well, how do we defeat Nazism? How do we defeat communism? Or some variation on that theme, which I think is very illustrative. But I just got to thinking, because again, as primarily a Middle East historian, more properly an Islamic world historian, who spent a lot of time studying the Ottomans, there's a reason they lasted for 600 years, and the Ottomans, I knew enough about Ottoman history to know there were some examples in their history where they had dealt with groups, both external and internal threats, both state and non-state threats, that were coming at them from the perspective of the Ottoman rulers, the Ottoman sultans. The Ottoman center is, remiss somehow in its Islam and needs to be combated. And so I just started looking at that. I've actually studied Ottoman. I'm not very good at reading Ottoman because it will make you go blind or crazy or both. I did study some Ottoman, but I don't have any actual Ottoman sources. I have two sons in high school, and I'm busy teaching. I don't have time to get off to Istanbul and check the archives, although that would probably make it a much better book. So I'm dealing with a lot of secondary sources, but I'm looking at, for instance, how the Ottomans dealt with. There's a number of groups I have them dealing with. And just so I don't forget, I'm looking at my little cheat sheet note list over here. 1, 2, 3, 4. I have six basically threats or challenges to the Ottoman Empire across space and time. And mind you, we're talking from the 1300s and 1400s up until the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century to some extent. The Ottomans often fought against. Do you want me to go into this, Pete, or would you go? Should I go off my soapbox for a moment?
No. Go ahead. I'm interested.
Okay. But basically, 6 different types of groups. The Ottomans, for a time, particularly in the 1300s and 1400s, when the Ottoman state was first being formed, before they actually sort of formalized it by taking over Constantinople and making it Istanbul, they often faced rebellions from Sufi groups, Islamic mystic groups, which, I think actually when I was on last time talking about Islamic stuff, I think we discussed the Sufis for a bit.
Yeah, we did.
And yeah, the Sufis in the modern world, people don't know, they're not Sunni, they're not Shia. They're not really a separate sect of Islam in so much as they are sort of a way of practicing Islam, and really the closest analog to Sufis in the Christian world might be sort of charismatic Christians in a sense. You can be Sunni or Shia and be Sufi, although most of them in the modern world are Sunni. But the Ottomans often faced rebellions from Sufi groups, particularly Sufi leaders who were charismatic and got into their head, or their followers got into their heads, that these guys were some sort of eschatological figure, the Mahdi, an apocalyptic messianic figure who should be followed. So the Ottomans fought a number of these groups. And ironically, what eventually happened over the course of a couple of centuries was the Ottomans basically assimilated a lot of the Sufi groups into the Ottoman state apparatus, such that by the time they faced another group, which was in the 17th century, really not so much a militant jihadist uprising against the Ottomans as it was an attempt to change the nature of the state domestically, particularly in the imperial capital in Istanbul. There's a group called the Qadizadelis. The Qadizadelis really were sort of proto-Salafi Wahhabis. Again, for people that don't know, that basically when you say Salafi or Wahhabi, you're talking Sunni fundamentalist Muslim. And they had these in the Ottoman Empire, and one of the reasons that they came close to gaining power in the Ottoman center, was they were very opposed to the Sufi group. The typical Salafi, which means the pious ancestors, which basically means Sunni Muslims who think a Muslim should live like the generation that surrounded Muhammad lived, at least how they think they live. Let's put it that way. Yeah. They're sort of the primitive Baptists of the Muslim world, if you will. I always want to. I drive by a primitive Baptist church sometimes going to my son's school, and I'm like, do you have a crank phone in there? Do you not use toilet paper? What exactly is primitive Baptist? Right. That they claim to live like the apostles did. This is what Salafis do in the Sunni Muslim world. They claim to live like the generation of Muhammad. But they hate Sufis. Sufis are sort of mystical. They revere their sheikhs. They have shrines to their dead sheikhs. You know about these people. Yeah. They're very big. Sufis are very big in Afghanistan. They are not very strict sometimes about things like drinking, which the Salafis always are. So the Ottomans for a while, and in fact a couple of Ottoman sultans in the 17th century supported these guys, and they were basically really fundamentalists and wanted to sort of change the nature of the state. There were riots so the Ottoman state eventually put them down, eventually decided this was not a good way to go. But this was a problem they faced. The Ottomans later on in the 18th century and again in the 19th century fought the Druze. The Druze are primarily in, what we now call the Levant, Israel, Syria, Lebanon area. Druze are sort of a strange heretical offshoot of Shia Islam that evolved into a separate religion. But they often fought the Ottomans. And they sometimes fought the Ottomans. They sometimes caused problems for the Ottomans in terms of invoking Western influence. Like, for instance, the Druze were one of the groups that attacked Maronite Christians in Syria, Lebanon area, particularly Lebanon, in the 19th century, which led to French intervention. The French sent troops in, which is one reason why you wound up with all the with one of the mandates being French after World War I. The Zaydis, there were several times where the Ottomans tried to conquer Yemen. The Zaydis are in Yemen, and this is directly relevant to what's going on there now, because Iran is supporting the Zaydis. They are Shia. They are not the same kind of Shia as Iranians. Iranians and Iraqis are 12 Shia. The Zaydis in Yemen are what are called 5 Shia. They trace the line of imams differently, but they believe in jihad. They make up about 40% of the population of Yemen. There are times in the past, if you go back to this entire millennium, go back to the turn of the second millennium, the third millennium, 1000 AD, there were times when the Zaydis ruled much of Yemen. And the Ottomans would try to conquer it. Sometimes they sort of succeeded. They came in once in the 16th century, 17th century left, came back again in the 19th century. So this is a very, very interesting counterinsurgency fight that the Ottomans were waging against these guys, which I think has direct parallels to what's going on today, where you've got Iran supporting the Zaydis, and of course Saudi Arabia supporting the Sunni majority there. One of the biggest problems for the Ottomans was the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis, two different, sort of like the Zaydis, two different times chronologically, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, well, before it was Saudi Arabia, when it was just Arabia, rose up against Ottoman rule. And for much of the same reason that the aforementioned Qatazadelis did. They were Islam, the Wahhabis are Sunni fundamentalists. They didn't like the Ottomans, not just because they were foreigners and Turks, but because the Ottomans, again, had a lot of Sufis in the state apparatus. A lot of the chaplains, for instance, in the Ottoman military were members of Sufi orders. Wahhabis, like Salafis writ large, hate the Sufis. The first time the Wahhabis erupted in the 18th century, the Ottomans captured the head of the Wahhab tribe, took him back to Istanbul, and beheaded him. So they dealt with it very violently. Of course, the Wahhabis again erupted after World War One, and eventually, of course, wound up winning in their alliance with the Saudi tribe, took over and created Saudi Arabia. And then also another one in the 19th century was, and the one that I've written about quite a bit for, was the rebellion from the Ottoman point of view, rebellion by Muhammad Ahmed, the Sudanese Mahdi. I know we talked about him before, Pete, and for the listeners may not know, go watch the movie, which you can buy for like $5.99 in a discount bin at Kroger and other grocery stores now, called Khartoum, with Charlton Heston and Sir Lawrence Olivier, which is what this 1962-1964 movie about the General Charles Gordon, who was a British general who was hired by the Ottomans to go to Sudan and try to lead the fight against Muhammad Ahmed, who had declared himself the Mahdi, the Islamic messianic figure. And if you watch Khartoum, what's interesting about it, of course, it's all, you never hear about the Turks. You just hear about it's the British fighting him. But it's the Egyptian army. Egypt technically at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire. So that's my 6 major groups. And I'm just trying to look at this. I'm finishing up the historical part of this. I'm looking at how these groups rebelled, what their ideologies were, what their approaches were, how the Ottomans responded. The Ottomans often responded, of course, not just with kinetic ops. Of course, the Ottomans were not, had no hesitancy about using kinetic operations, shall we say. But the Ottomans also realized that since almost all of these groups were some kind of Islamic challenge, the Druze possibly being the only exception, some sort of ideological religious challenge, as well as people with guns or swords, the Ottomans often had to deal with them in terms of delegitimizing them. So what I'm trying to do is get all this together, and I'm almost done with this part, and I'm going to try to fit this into sort of some of the paradigms of modern counterinsurgency, and then see, can we learn anything, or maybe can our Islamic allies learn something from how the Ottomans dealt with these sorts of challenges?
We know that the Ottomans would use kinetic operations, and for the audience, that means killing folks. So they go in and do that because that's the classic way you put down a rebellion. And would you say that a rebellion is a subset or a smaller order counterinsurgency, a smaller order insurgency, or do they break off and become something different?
Oh, that's a good question, and I try to deal with some of that in my opening. What's doubly confusing too in the literature, particularly as regards Ottoman, these types of rebellions against the Ottoman state, against Islamic states in general, and the Ottoman state in particular. But a few of the actual prominent articles have been written on this use the term mutinies.
Yeah.
Like, oh God, that just muddies the waters, literally.
Right.
Because I don't know, when I hear a mutiny, I think master and commander, or
yeah, I'm out there in Pitcairn Island.
I know it's a naval thing. So yeah, well, these Ottoman historians, I don't think.
The other thing,
but anyway, Pete, let me try to answer your question,
please.
Basically, okay, ask me the question again. Let me see if I got it straight.
The difference between a rebellion and putting that down and an insurgency that you're going to counter.
Yeah. Basically, I'm looking at it as an insurgency is more broad-based.
Okay.
An insurgency is more of a threat. An insurgency, is probably larger in geographic scope, probably has an ideological aspect to it that a rebellion may not have, and it is usually perceived by the Ottoman state as something that takes more serious measures than possibly a rebellion might. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it right now.
And then, did you see any evolution in in their tactical or strategic thought, the Ottomans, and how they approach this? Did they advance the game in terms of countering and putting down?
Well, yes, there was definitely there was a change. I'm not sure it was an evolution, but there was a change. Um, like for instance, again with the earlier stuff, it tends just to be slice and dice and kill as many of them as you can, and you don't worry too much about ideological rebuttal or riposte, I guess you could say. It was just how dare you challenge the Sultan. You got this. This tended to be, I think, sort of the paradigm, the template. By the time you get to the second Ottoman attempt to put down the Zaidi rebellion, the second Ottoman occupation of Yemen, which is in the 19th century, it's changed. And the Ottomans, and a lot of it has changed because the Ottomans have taken their cues from Western Europe. This is, you had the first serious reforms of the Ottoman military in the early 19th century, with the Nizami Jadid, where the Sultan replaced the old Janissaries with a more modern type military, and then the Ottomans had sent people to study in Britain and Vienna and even in Paris, and came back with their knowledge base somewhat improved. They borrowed a lot from Western sources. One interesting thing too, a lot of people don't know this, is not only I mentioned earlier, like for instance, Charles Gordon. Charles Gordon, Pete, you probably know. Some people may not know. Charles Gordon was also known as Chinese Gordon, right? Because he had been hired by the Manchu to help put down the Taiping rebellion, and the Ottomans thought this might sort of transfer. The Taiping rebellion, by the way, in case people don't know, was a messianic Christian rebellion in China. But the Ottomans were fond, in particular, the Ottomans were fond of hiring Western military veterans. In Egypt, they did this a lot. In the 1880s, when Britain occupied Egypt in 1880, 1881, many of the ranking staff, in fact, the chief of staff of the Egyptian army was a former Confederate colonel. Yeah, the Ottomans had hired, the Egyptians, who technically were part of the Ottoman Empire, had hired Western advisors, basically, and not just advisors, they had these guys in charge. So anyway, that's a roundabout way of saying basically what you get by the late 19th century, maybe the mid 19th century, certainly late 19th century, is the influence of Western military tactics. But the Ottomans seem to have learned the wrong lessons. Like for instance, as near as I can tell, in Yemen, although they're fighting a counterinsurgency, and they did do some sort of counterinsurgent things, like attempt to win hearts and minds. Like for instance, the Ottomans. I mean, Yemen is clearly, I don't know if you've ever been to Yemen. I haven't been to.
Not me, no.
Almost went once, and they told me not to go. But it's pretty much of a backwater. You can imagine what it was like in the 19th century. The Ottomans would do things, however, sort of trying to win hearts and minds. They went in there and tried to build roads. They tried to build some madrasas, right, some schools for these poor Yemenis, and it didn't really work. They tried to hire local Yemenis as part of the military, which of course just got them branded as traitors, basically. But in terms of military strategy, a lot of what the Ottomans did was they basically they were taking Napoleonic tactics, the maneuver, trying to use maneuver battle and mass battle in infantry, and that the same way that Napoleon did in artillery against the Yemeni. And this didn't work. The Yemenis are coming down out of the mountains and attacking, hit and run guerrilla attacks, and this didn't really work very well. So it looks like what they did, particularly in Yemen, by the 19th century, was they're trying to use Western military tactics, which were kind of an evolution from what the Ottomans had been doing previously, but they were using the wrong ones. They weren't using any counterinsurgency. They were just using direct conventional battle techniques. It didn't work that well.
So I want to ask you this. So we're back in the 19th century. I guess someone with some fancy Ottoman-style clothes saunters on down to Georgia and goes and looks up old General Anderson or something. I mean, is this... how
they wound up with those guys?
Yeah. I mean, there's no LinkedIn, like looking for former commanders, kind of thing.
Well, there's an interesting book on this which came out years ago. My gosh, 1960 or something. The Blue and the Gray on the Nile. And I read it a while back, and I don't have a copy of it, and I should get another copy. And basically, it sounds like that the Egyptians basically just put the word out through the embassy in the United States, particularly the Ottoman embassy, that they wanted to use some guys. And there was an interesting connection here. Basically, they're willing to hire. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these guys got hired a little bit later. And don't forget, Pete, and I think this had something to do with it, although I haven't looked into it and I really want to. General Longstreet
Mm-hmm.
actually was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire for about a year and a half.
Yeah.
This was under the, Benjamin Harrison administration. Because Longstreet, after the war, who had been very good friends, I guess, with Grant at West Point, became a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
which is why, so many people down here still hate him. That plus he dared to tell Bobby Lee that they frontal charge at Gettysburg was not a good idea.
Right.
But he became a Republican after the war and served in a number of administrations and then wound up being I think we didn't actually have an ambassador then, it was the consul, the American consul to the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that had something to do with it too. But basically, I think it was just they put the word out, and a lot of these guys, these guys that were colonels and such, they couldn't get work, they couldn't get back in the military. So when the Ottomans or the Egyptians offered to pay them money, a bunch of them left at it.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, if you want to try to get back on your feet, this is a good way to do it. And so yeah, that's interesting that they would hire those guys, and that I guess that was the most current war to date, right? And if you wanted to go out and get your guys up to speed and everything, that would be a good well to draw from. Interesting. Hey, I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk to you about the current administration, the Trump administration, and how they are handling our issues in the Middle East. We had, the Bush Doctrine, which President Obama, you pretty much followed down the line, trying to push out freedom. But President Trump has taken a different tactic. And what do you think of what he's doing and Secretary Mattis, and are they successful? Or what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the overall thing they're trying to do is we're recentering our policy in the Middle East from trying to, sort of lure Iran into being a rational actor, which is really what Obama was about. And I have to say, although, never voted for the man, I have to say that this was not a bad idea. But the problem was, I think it evinced a real misunderstanding, because you have people like Ben Rhodes who, don't know a damn thing about Iran.
Mm-hmm.
It evinced this really misunderstanding of what the ideology behind that runs that state, Iran, that is. What Trump's doing is turning us back to what had been our traditional policy, going back to FDR, which was centered on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, admittedly schizophrenically, because the official ideology of the state of Saudi Arabia, as we talked about earlier, is Wahhabi Islam, which is basically fundamentalist Sunni Islam, which is inveterately opposed to Western values in most ways. But yet, politically, the Saudi state has been our ally for many years. Of the major states in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is much smaller in population than the three big ones, of course, are Egypt, Turkey, and Iran,
Mm-hmm.
each of which have about 80 million people. Saudi Arabia punches way above its weight. Why? Because it's got so much oil. But basically, what Trump is doing is not really that radical. It was really Obama's attempt to sort of lure Iran or appease Iran, or perhaps I don't want to be that negative with that word, but entice Iran, let's say, into being more of a rational actor, as I said earlier. That was sort of the radical departure from American policy since 1979. Because since 1979, every administration has had Iran on the list at the top of the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
Right.
And Iran's, as I've said before, and I think you and I may have talked about this before, I have no doubt Iran's trying to get nuclear weapons. Iran wants nuclear weapons, however, I am firmly convinced, for regime insurance. So what Trump is doing, I think, is right. But then, of course, or it makes sense. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't say it's right, but it makes a lot of sense. But then the problem, of course, then is this. Although geopolitically, or politically, I should say, Saudi Arabia is our ally, ideologically, the Islam that Saudi Arabia promotes around the world and has been doing so for 30 years now with a lot of money is basically fundamentalist Sunni Islam. So, and this differs maybe perhaps in an angstrom unit from the sort of Islam that ISIS and Al Qaeda and Boko Haram, and for that matter, the Taliban put out. So there's that problem. And then, of course, then we have it all
Right.
complicated now by the fact that almost certainly Mohammed bin Salman, the heir to the throne, the heir apparent, the guy that's going to, upgrade Saudi Arabia or modernize it in some ways, was almost certainly behind the killing of Khashoggi. And again, I harbor no illusions about that. I mean,
Right.
very few people besides the leaders, perhaps the leadership of Israel, stay in power in that part of the world without getting their hands bloody. So I sort of this false outrage we get from a lot of people is kind of amusing, I think. Like, do you think the Ayatollahs stay in power by being, kinder and gentler? So that said,
that's exactly how they do it.
What Trump is doing, I think, makes some sense. But the problem in it, then, as I was trying to get at, is that you are then supporting a state, and you are making as one of your two major allies in the region, besides Israel, a state that supports a brand of religion that produces most of the world's terrorists.
Let's spend a minute there. And I know we've talked about this before, but I don't want someone to have not done the work of listening to the previous thing, because Lord knows, folks don't get into the literature at the academic level. So,
hey, this is John Leon Guerrero, co-host of the Break It Down Show and fellow producer here at Lions Rock Productions. And I'm proud to announce our newest show coming in January. It's called Justice. Season 1 is going to be a deep dive into some of the cases I personally worked on as a licensed private investigator, and you'll get a unique view into the criminal justice system that may just challenge some of your personal notions about how it should work and open your eyes in ways you never imagined. So keep your ears open for Justice, a brand new podcast coming in January from Lions Rock Productions to iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
because Lord knows, folks don't get into the literature at the academic level. So when you say that, and President Trump has his Islamic ban that he put down, which really wasn't
right.
that. It was focused on the places that produce the most evil people that want to harm us. So when you say that, you're saying that because this is not Dr. Tim Furnish saying it, although you are actually saying it physically, but this is our intelligence systems that says the world recognizes these places as producing the most people that want to do the biggest, baddest harm. That's why we have to deal with this thing. And then it makes it weird because even when President Bush was talking about how we're going to go after terrorism, like we are going to go invade Saudi Arabia, we certainly weren't going to go invade Ireland.
Well, to be fair, I mean, the IRA is just a few guys.
So what are we talking about here?
Fax machine at this point. I don't think it's really that big a threat. So, I kind of get your point. Look, I'm looking at the latest list here. I got it. The U.S. State Department Foreign Terrorist Organization list, okay? There are 6, and I just printed this one off. Let's see. This was from October and went through the count again because it changes every so often. There are 67 groups on this list, all right? 51 of them are Islamic groups. 76%. Okay. I had to do a calculator with that. I will confess. I had to use a calculator. That's 76%. Okay. So it is certainly the case that although most Muslims are not terrorists, most of the world's terrorists are Muslim. And you see all this sort of like folderol put out by certain groups that, they're more right-wing terrorists. No, there aren't. This is goofy stuff from the ADL and other groups that will count a terrorist attack like spray painting a swastika on a Sikh temple. Boy, that's a confused person, isn't it? They will count that as tantamount to killing somebody or flying an airplane into a building. What doesn't count? The metric is not attacks. The metric is death toll, and the death toll by Muslim terrorist groups is far above anybody else. Now, I was just talking about this last week in the last week of classes in my Middle East history class I'm teaching concerned. And I pointed out that, actually President Obama was exactly right a couple of years ago when he said that, terrorism, although terrorism is bad, put it in perspective. Every year, in recent years, about 20,000 people die in terrorist attacks around the world. Now, that's 20,000 too many. But more people die on American roads, every year. And we haven't declared a war on cars yet. So you have to put that in perspective. And again, I'm not trying to minimize terrorism, but it's if you're dead, you're equally dead whether you had a car wreck or the terrorist whacked you. I totally understand that. But you have to put it in perspective. It's not a threat that's going to bring down Western civilization. Terrorism is not going to do that.
What makes it so exciting, though? I mean, it definitely draws our attention when something happens. If some dude right now were to go to some kind of Hanukkah fest, because Hanukkah's going on right now, and strap on a vest,
right? Because that means that person who did that is doing exactly the purpose of terrorism. And you know this, Pete. What is the point of terrorism? The point of terrorism is not death toll. It's to make a political statement.
Yeah.
It's to advance a political cause or to degrade a political cause you don't like.
Right.
And that's exactly the point of it. It's been like that going back to the, I taught a class on terrorism last term, and really the first terrorists we can go back to the Assyrians and such, but really the first true terrorist group that we have much data on was the Sicarii, the Jewish terrorists that were attacking the Romans or in the time Jesus lived. And nobody in their right mind thought they were going to defeat the Roman army by whacking a few Roman soldiers. But that wasn't what they were about. They were about making a point. I mean, could argue that Bin Laden or Ibrahim al-Baghdadi or these guys really don't know history very well. Although you may say, well, okay, Bin Laden had them fly the airplanes into the buildings on 9/11, not really to kill a lot of people, although they're perfectly happy with that. But Bin Laden's bigger strategic goal, which to some degree he succeeded in, was to get Americans to attack the Middle East, to attack Muslims. So then therefore you could say people like him, his epigones and followers could say, well, see, now the West is attacking Islam, and then therefore try to make it into a civilizational struggle. I'm not quite sure they succeeded in that. But that was the point. I mean, killing as many Americans as possible was just, not to be crass or anything, but to them just icing on the cake. They were trying to cause a political furor, and that was more what they were about. So, but here's the thing, I blogged quite a long blog on my website back when I did this in October on Trump's new counterterrorism strategy, and you pointed out earlier it's a bit of a break, not just in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of approach with what Bush and Obama had done. And I think the big thing is this, and I entitled it "The One-Eyed Man is Still King," because I think that whereas to some degree Bush and Obama had both eyes closed, Trump at least has one eye open. And it's this, and I know people find that it's politically incorrect, and people find it offensive, and I don't do things to be offensive. Well, I don't know, my wife might disagree, but for the most part I don't. Which is that I try to just study things, and then wherever it falls from that, the info that I come up with, I have to deal with that. I can't deal with wishful thinking. And again, as I pointed out, 76% of the groups on the terrorist list are Muslim. Some of them are even more. The UAE, that would be the United Arab Emirates, a couple of years ago, put out a list, and they had, I believe, 82 or 83 groups on the list, and 81 of the groups on their list were Muslim. So this is not something that, and again, this list is not something that Trump just came up with. You can go back to the Clinton administration, and the figures may change a little bit, but it's always in the 50, 60% more that most of the terrorist groups are Islamic. Now, why is this? Well, let me not start there. I don't want to say why is this. What I want to say is neither the Bush nor the Obama administration would admit this, and I think the first step to dealing with a problem is saying that there's a problem. And I don't agree with this idea that, like the people in Saudi Arabia aren't big boys and can't pull up their, whatever you wear underneath the stove, I'm not sure. But you can't pull that up and say, we're not going to snowflake all over, the empty quarter, which is not going to work anyway. When the Americans say, hey, guys, you've got a problem here. Can you deal with it? You keep telling us Islam is peaceful, except that these guys keep saying they're fighting jihad. Now, where did you get this idea, if Islam is peaceful, that jihad is okay? So again, and this, to circle back to what we were talking about with the Ottoman stuff, the Ottomans didn't pretend the groups they were fighting were not Muslim. They dealt with them, and they would send people out. They wouldn't say, we can't talk about whether they're Muslim or not. The Sultan would say, go refute those a-holes. And while you're at it, if you kill some, I'm fine with that. But they would put fatwas. Like, for instance, when this guy Muhammad Ahmed popped up in Sudan in 1880, declared himself a Mahdi, the rightly guided one, the Islamic Messiah figure, the Ottomans basically they took him seriously enough because he had lots of followers that they had the senior Ottoman clerics in Sudan and in Egypt, because Sudan was a sub-province of Egypt, put out stuff based on the Quran and Hadith saying you are not the Mahdi and here's why. List of stuff. I dealt with a bunch of this stuff in my doctorate dissertation, so I'm trying not to remember it. It makes my head hurt. But it's that sort of thing. You can't just simply get rid of a problem by saying, it's out of bounds or something. And we got that a lot, and that's what the Bush and the Obama administration did. And the Trump administration, to credit, is at least willing to say, and I point this out, like, for instance, if you go through, I read through Obama's national counterterrorism strategy, and I think it mentioned the word Islam once and never mentioned it in the context of terrorism. Trump does at least say radical Islamist terrorism, which is problematic in its own right, as I point out. But to deal with the problem, because we have many Islamic allies, and again, most Muslims do not agree with what these guys are doing. Well, then let's have them refute it. But being afraid that Muslims are going to be offended because you connect the word Islam or Islamist to terrorism is basically just saying, oh, we can't talk about it. Well, I think we do need to talk about it. Because keep in mind that most of the people that are killed by terrorists are not in the West. They're in the Islamic countries. They're in what we call third world countries. And I don't ascribe. Is it ascribe or subscribe? I don't buy into the idea that
I think it depends.
It doesn't matter just because they're not killing Americans or Frenchmen or something. I mean, I think it's a problem that they're killing people. As I said earlier, it's probably not going to bring down a civilization, but it's certainly causing a lot of problems for people. And I should add, where it would cause a real problem is if they were to get their hands on actual WMDs, which a lot of the groups are trying to do. But anyway, my bottom line is,
that's always the big goal, right? Like, can we get something to change the game?
And that would be the thing that changes the game. If Al-Qaeda or ISIS had a nuclear weapon, I have no doubt they'd set it up off in downtown Manhattan.
Yeah, if at all possible, right? Yeah. The good thing is thus far they've always wanted to email about it or Instagram about it, so we've been able to stay one step ahead of them, just barely. So let me ask you this then: when we have this. When we look domestically, we have this problem where when we see President Trump, a lot of us lose our mind and we lose our rational. And in this case, I'm talking about the folks that despise, the never Trump folks, not the folks that are like, no matter what he does, it's great. So let's talk about the never Trump folks. Are they able to see any value, or how about, let me ask you this, why can't they see any success in President Trump's at least changing of tactics? We were going down a road that wasn't necessarily
because that
working.
would entail them admitting that
what's going on there.
That they were wrong, and that's just not going to happen. I mean, and by the way, Pete, I'm glad you said some success. I mean, and again, I brought this up in my Middle East history class the other day, last lecture. I showed the map of the area that ISIS controlled for their so-called caliphate a few years ago, and the areas that ISIS controls now, and it's greatly reduced. Now, basically, that doesn't mean ISIS is going to go away. It's going to devolve into being just a terrorist group instead of a territorial state. It's not going away. It's got branches in 15 countries. But, the Trump administration has made a concerted effort to actually do something about the ISIS problem instead of just, strategic drone strikes or whatever Obama was doing, kinder, gentler counterinsurgency, whatever that was. But why do never Trumpers? I just think a lot of it, and I got a lot of friends that are never Trumpers. I just think they refuse. They just don't want to admit they were wrong about something, or they don't want to admit that a guy is crass and as big a jackass as Donald Trump, which is true. I was kind of talked into voting for him by my wife, who's an attorney. I love this feminist thing about it. Conservative white men told their wives who to vote for. I'm like, mister, you never stepped foot in my house, have you? You think I tell my wife who to vote for? You are insane. I think people just don't want to admit that a guy that crass and that big of a jackass could actually be successful at something. I mean, why do we have 3.7% unemployment? I'm pretty sure his policies had something to do with that. But Can't get people to admit that either.
Yeah, tax revenues are up, unemployment's down across the board for everybody. Wages are going up. Yeah, so at some point we have to deal. If we're going to be reasonable and learn anything from this, you have to be reasonable and say these things have gone well. How about the progress in North Korea, the DPRK?
I mean, the man should get a Nobel Peace Prize for that. He really probably should. I mean, as weird as that is to say.
Yeah. And you know, it's not ever going to be a straight road with North Korea, and frankly with us, you know. but we were talking about, and everybody was convinced, you know, not everybody, but many people were convinced that World War III was about to start, even though that makes no damn sense. And here we are now, about to have a second summit. We've got a train that goes to and across the north and south across the Korean peninsula. There's a lot of progress where no president of the last 5 or 6 presidents has been able to broker that kind of a deal. We might actually see the official end of that war. That's crazy.
Trump's the first American president to actually meet with a North Korean leader. So, I mean, oh my God, he called him Little Rocket Man. I don't know. It's like my wife always says, you don't spend that much time in real estate, particularly in New York, and not kind of know how to negotiate.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. Hey,
Would I prefer somebody that was a little smoother and like maybe wasn't on Twitter so much? Yeah.
But it's not the guy we got, and we didn't have that person for a choice. No one who was viable was that, you know. And also, you know, I remember things. So one of the things I remember is we were desperate for somebody who would just kind of be candid and quit being so political all the time, you know, and here you go. You got it. Here's a guy that says he's going to do this, and I'll be damned. He goes out and says he's going to build a wall, and he's building the wall. And he says he's going to go after ISIS, and I'll be damned. He's going to hold it to the other nations that we have trade agreements with, and we're going to stop laying down, and I'll be damned. He's doing it. So we're actually getting what we asked for.
I'm trying to figure out what exactly are they going to impeach Trump for? 3.7% unemployment, peace in Korea. Which of these things are impeachable offenses? I'm trying to figure that out.
He's a lot of negative adjectives. I don't even want to start the list. And he drives me crazy that he takes whatever success he has and throws it away, but with just unforced errors over and over again. You know, it's.
He's not Ronald Reagan, but on the other hand, these are probably the most Reagan-esque policies we've had since Reagan rode off into the sunset.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about a fencing analogy, you know, because you like fencing and everything. And it's like he's out there and he's tapping away, you know, and then he's like, oh, yeah, let me show you how good I am. And then he's like hitting himself and scoring for the other guy. You know? Would you?
Yeah, he's up 9-0. No, he's up 14-0 because the fencing match goes to 15. But then he just stands there and hits himself about 8 or 9 times. Then he goes ahead and wins.
On purpose, yeah.
But he could have won 15-0, but he wins 15-9.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And I can't imagine what's going to happen because as of today, right now, there's no reason to believe that he won't win re-election. You know, it's...
I can't see any of that pack on the left beating him.
Yeah. There's a bunch of... You talk about incorrigible people... Yikes, there's a lot of, we've had that already, a whole bunch of people that say really offensive things all the time, and then they're going to have to go against the guy that can go unemployment, North Korea, ISIS, and just talk about wins all day long, you know? When was the last time a major corporation said, hey, the president said we better stay open, and they did? Or when Apple's like, we're going to reinvest $350 billion back into America, you know?
Probably not since FDR.
Yeah, so he's going to be able to run on that stuff and probably won't. Probably will say ridiculous things the whole time and drive a frenzy and I don't know. Anyhow, it's maddening.
And probably win,
let me talk to you about album fights because you've done enough of them. You understand the process and you're a PhD, so you understand sort of kind of what we're doing from the academic side of things. But what are your thoughts?
Oh, I love it, Pete. I think it's a great idea. I'm surprised that, I'm surprised no one thought of it before you, but I'm glad you did.
Nice.
Although I'm kind of in that like 70s rock ghetto, which is okay. That's kind of my wheelhouse. So.
That's all right. I mean, everybody has their strong suit, and I don't think that you're opposed to branching out into other things. You know, you did U2 versus the Doors. There you go.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. And hey, are we going to do? And what's the one we're still
La
thinking about
Futura,
doing?
and then David Bowie Heroes, I think, is the one that we're going to.
Bowie and ZZ Top.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And we're going to do that as soon as we get through the mixtape, holiday season mixtape craze that we're going to do here coming up. So it's in the works. We're going to do that soon. But what stands out in terms of this compare and contrast exercise? What have you realized by going through it?
I realized that a lot of the songs of the years I didn't listen that closely to, and it forced me to do that. It forced me to do research on, the settings of the albums and what was going on with the bands at the time, and not just internal politics and stuff, but like what kind of instruments were in vogue at that time and things like that. And of course, the social stuff. What are people singing about? The stuff the Doors are singing about in the late '60s is a lot different from what U2's singing about in the year 2000.
Yeah.
So overall, it was really interesting to make myself sit down and look at the musical stuff and the social stuff and kind of try to see where it matches up.
Yeah, and what matters to you? Like, what's turned out to be important? Like, I know for me, one thing that I've lost is I really don't like the triumphant guitar. Just if it's too much, like sometimes Eddie Van Halen is too much. I'm like, oh, there's just so much guitar in this. I find that I don't like that. And it turns out even more than I thought, I really like, songs of protest and songs that have a social conscience a lot more than I realized.
What's really struck me, I think maybe this may seem a little petty, but I think a big thing for me has been like, I forced myself to listen to how the drums play. Because I never paid much attention to percussion before. And it just, I've had to force myself to listen and hear just how important drums are in every song. And so I pay attention to drummers in ways that I never did before. I mean, look, hey, the first drummer I ever learned anything about was Ringo. We all know he sucked, right?
Yeah.
Although it turns out, of course, Ringo was a really, really, really good drummer.
Yeah.
But we just said, it's Ringo. He happened to get hanging on with three guys at the right time, and turned out the guy's a
damn good drummer.
But
yeah.
So it's stuff like that I never paid a whole lot of attention. You're right. Everybody pays attention to this, and the bass. Everybody pays attention to the lead guitar and the vocals.
Also, the floor of the album, the songs that barely make the cut. They stand out a lot more now because you're actually going through, like my brother and I a couple years ago during the Olympics, Summer Olympics, started trying to pick who would come in last, and then that would be our guy. We'd root like crazy for him, and it made the whole event so much more fun because you're actually rooting for your guy to finish last, and we were in our own way recognizing him, but it also made us pay attention to, a whole other half of the field we never even really considered,
Right. Yeah. So like basically a lot of these albums, you know the 3 or 4 or 5 really big songs because a lot of them were singles and big hits, and the other stuff you're like, you never listened to. You never really listened to it. I mean, even I remember when I used to listen to albums or cassettes or CDs. You get the one you didn't like and you skip it.
Yeah.
So now I can't skip. Something I don't like when I'm doing it for you because I got to listen to it because I got to be able to talk a little bit about it. So that's actually good.
Songs that you never ever like, not even deep cut songs where you're just like, wow, they don't even play this live.
Right. Even the band doesn't like this song anymore.
That's hilarious. Hey, what else do you want to cover with our time left here? We only got a few more minutes.
I should mention that since I led off with that Middle East versus Middle Earth thing, that my first, I've written one book on, it's not actually on Tolkien. I tell people on Tolkien, but it's not actually on Tolkien. It's much geekier than that. It's a political history of Middle Earth. It's called High Towers and Strong Places, a political history of Middle Earth. Well, I was under contract by a publisher in Toronto called Aloris, which has since gone under, which is why if you go look for my book on Amazon, it comes up for $837 because there's like 4 copies left. But if anyone would like to buy those, I won't complain. But initially I was writing, and this is the book I'm trying to write, which became the second volume. It's a military history of Middle Earth. That's really what got me into this because my sons and I watched the movies, and I've read all the books. Plus I've read the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and all that stuff. I've actually read everything, unlike some people, because again I'm a geek. And a few years ago I thought military history would be really interesting. So I started working on that. And I had to do all this prefatory material because to explain who's fighting in the wars in the first age and the second age and the third age of Tolkien's history, you got to say which kingdoms it is. So I done all this prefatory sort of background stuff, and the publisher said, let's publish that as a separate volume, which is what we did. It's sort of anthropological in a lot of ways. I compare like physical faculties of elves and men and orcs and hobbits and dwarves and say, what kind of weapons did they use? How would they fight? Blah, blah, blah. I know it's very geeky. But I actually did a little bit of sort of like market testing. I contacted some people I knew that are big gamers and stuff. And they're like, we would totally buy that book. And I'm like, okay. So I'm working on that, and that's the big one. I'm trying to get this out by next summer. And the Ottoman counterinsurgency book's almost done. And so I'm working again on the second military history, actually the second volume, which is the military history book of Middle Earth, which we called Bright Swords and Glorious Warriors. This is another phrase that I told you. In military history, Middle Earth.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Will the first volumes come out and print somewhere else then, or?
Yeah, here's what we're going to do. In fact, I have the rights to all the text. There's some really good artwork in it. The publisher had contracted this nice lady, Anki Eisman, who lives in where does Anki live? Norway, I think. And then I had another guy that did the maps for me, which are just wonderful. I don't have the rights to those, but my wife and I are going to republish it on Amazon just as text, probably, and we'll probably try to get that out in the spring before the other one comes out, and hopefully it won't be $837.
Hopefully,
$9.99. That's with a dot after the first one.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll connect you to Chris Schaefer, the CEO of Tactical 16. Those guys publish things, and let them have the second edition and do a.
Well, I'm looking for a publisher since the other one went down. Send me something offline, Pete. I'd like to know.
I will do. All right. Well, let's get you back in the ring with your tuxedo T-shirt on. Let's get these doing some judging here. I'll probably have you sit in on one of these. We're doing mixtape, love-based mixtapes. And so probably have you come in on one of these fights, and definitely get you come back and talk about the Middle Earth stuff as soon as you get the next book out.
All right, will do. Thank you.